Hey everyone, sorry for the delay. I accidentally had my settings set to the Facebook Live on my streaming software, so I didn't really have it set up for YouTube. So when I try to go on there, it wasn't working, and then I realized, oh, I have the wrong settings. But anyway, here we are on this YouTube Live on Friday, September 15th. And I already see that some people were here leaving comments, and I apologize that I'm late, but I am here. So what are we doing today? Today we're going to look at a Photoshop example. It's going to deal with the LAB color mode, and we're going to look at some composites that people have submitted. If you remember, last week we did one composite review. This week we have a few others that I'm going to talk about and give my opinion as to how they could be improved. So what I'm going to do is make sure that I have my chat open so that I could see it and look at your comments as this is going on. Let me just set that up. Okay, so we're gonna get started with this image here. As I said, we're gonna work in the LAB color mode. And actually, before I start, let me just say hi to all those people who are saying hello in the chat. We have people from Macau, Afghanistan. There's Tracy again. Hi, Tracy. People from Saudi Arabia. So yeah, thanks so much for being here. Again, for those of you that don't know, I am in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, United States. Tracy from Wales. Hey, Tracy. Oh, there's there's my good buddy Mark Heaps. He's in Austin, Texas. But yeah, so we're gonna get started just with a quick example of the LAB color mode. This is actually sort of a preview of a tutorial that I have coming up. So yeah, so for those of you that don't know, there's multiple color modes in Photoshop. We have the RGB color mode, which is probably what you're used to working with. There's also the CMYK color mode that is usually used in print. And there's also the LAB color mode that you could apply to an image, and it works differently than RGB, and it gives you some advantages that you may be interested in. So we're going to switch over to the LAB color mode. Nothing really is going to look different in the image, but if you look at the tab, now you have the LAB color mode here. And that allows you to work with different channels, 3 different channels, much like RGB. We have lightness, A, and B. So lightness is the detail, the luminance values of the image. A is the relationship between green and magenta, and blue is the relationship between, B is the relationship between blue and yellow. So these are much like the tint sliders in Camera Raw in Lightroom, the A channel, and the B channel is much like the temperature sliders in Camera Raw in Lightroom. But anyway, so the advantage of working with these channels separately is that we can apply tonal adjustments without affecting the color, and vice versa. So she's wearing a red dress, so if we wanted to make her dress green, we could come into the background, duplicate it, go into the channels panel, and in the A channel we could just invert that, Control I, Command I on the Mac, and that converts it into a green dress. Notice that the luminance values are still there. We didn't really adjust any of the luminance. Obviously we would have to go in there and create a layer mask to mask out the dress, and obviously that's not a very precise selection, but you get the idea. So that's one advantage of working in the LAB color mode. You separate luminance from color. Another thing that you can do is in the lightness channel, you can actually, let me duplicate the layer so you can see the difference. So in the lightness channel, we can actually apply a sharpening effect. So I'm going to go into filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, and I'm just going to do like a really extreme sharpen. And as a side note, Photoshop doesn't really add detail when it sharpens an image. It just increases the contrast of the edges. So you can see that very clearly here. It's trying to fake detail really. So I'm going to press OK, and I'm going to go back into my layer, and there it is. I've made that sharpening effect. So now I'm going to go back into the original layer, and actually I'll duplicate it. That way I can work non-destructively, and I can just delete the layers later. So I have this duplicate. It looks just like the original, and I'm going to apply the same effect. If you go into filter and select the first option in the filter menu, it's always the last filter that you applied. In this case is the unsharp mask. So I'm going to select that, and it's going to apply the same effect. Now look at the difference. See how the color affected her arm? The one on the bottom, the one we're looking at now, is the sharpening that was applied to all the channels at the same time. This is the sharpening that was applied just to the luminance value. So if you're ever working with sharpening images and they're affecting the color, this is one way of sharpening an image without really affecting the color. Also, another advantage of working with the LAB color mode is that you can solve interesting problems. Somebody asked me a question recently via a message, and the question was, how do you invert the luminance of an image without inverting the color? So how do I make the blacks on this image white without, and the whites black without affecting the color? And the only way I can think of doing that is through the LAB color mode. So you would take the lightness value, the lightness channel, the L channel, Control I, Command I to invert. That inverts the luminance, but when we go back into the 3-channel view, we can see that the colors were not affected. So the dress is still red and the colors are all the same, except for the luminance that was inverted. So that was my way of answering that question. So I'm just throwing that out there in case anybody has a similar problem and they need to figure out how to do it. And I'm just going to quickly look through the questions, make sure that there's no questions, and I'll bring that in here just so that you guys could see. I realize that in the recordings you guys can't see the questions, and sometimes it takes too long for me to read them, and I'm just going through all of them. It's mainly a bunch of people saying hello, so hello to everybody. It looks like we have people from all over the world, and I'm probably going to miss a few, but we have Wales, Slovenia, Greece, Amsterdam, Mexico, USA, Austin, Texas, Mark, Palestine, India, a whole bunch of places, Czech Republic, Virginia, US, Tahiti, Puerto Riqueño. Nice. Yeah, so a whole bunch of people. So thanks so much for joining me in this YouTube live. One of the questions is, how do I do a sketch portrait in CS6? So if you're talking about like a sort of like a drawing from a photo effect, I have a video on that on my YouTube channel. But anyway, so yeah, so that's some of the things that you can do with the LAB color mode. And the last thing that I wanted to show you with the LAB color mode is, again, separating luminance from color. So we can make an extreme adjustment to this image, and you can see that we're only affecting the luminance, not really the color. So let me go back into the RGB mode. So I'm gonna delete these layers, go back into the RGB color mode, and I'm gonna try to do the same thing, but this time with a obviously RGB curves. And notice that when I make that adjustment, I do affect the color. I can sort of go and do something similar by changing the blending mode and not affect the luminosity by selecting the luminosity blending mode. So notice that once I do that, I'm affecting the luminance of the image and not affecting the color as much. So that's one way of doing the same thing in the RGB color mode. I'm gonna delete this layer and I'm gonna go into the LAB color mode once again. And look at the tab, I'm back in the LAB color mode. And the one thing I wanted to show you, the last thing I want to show you, is that if you apply an effect with an adjustment layer and you want to go back into RGB, Photoshop is not going to let you. It's going to ask you to either discard or flatten the image, and you probably don't want to do either. So the workaround around that is that you would select the layers that you have, right click on them, and convert it to a smart object. Then you can go into image, mode, RGB, don't rasterize it, and we're in the RGB color mode. Look at the tab here, and if we want to make an adjustment to that LAB curve, just open up the smart object. If you go into image mode, you'll see that it's in the LAB color mode, and we can continue making adjustments to our LAB image, close it, save it, and we'll be back in RGB. So I'm again looking at the chat, making sure that there's no questions on that. And awesome. Yeah, thank you. Somebody, I'll bring the chat back so that we could all see it. Hello, hello, hello. Awesome, everybody. Thanks so much. How can you change black color from car to white? That's really hard, mainly because the shadows are also black. So if the car has you know, if most of the car is black, it's going to be really difficult to get the right shadows and things like that. The question is, when do you know to work with LAB instead of RGB? It really depends on what you're doing. As I said, the reason I thought about this example is because somebody asked me that question, whether or not I knew how to invert the luminance without affecting the color. So it took me a second, and once I realized, oh yeah, I could do it in LAB, I gave him that question and it solved their problem. And you know, I thought about doing this example for you guys. So it really depends on what you're doing. If you're ever working on a project that you must separate luminance from color to make your adjustments, and that'll be a good indicator of using LAB. Okay, so now if there's no other questions on this example, we're going to move on to some of the composites that people have submitted. So that should be pretty fun. Before we get into that though, I want to start out by showing you this composite. And that right there is my very, very first ever composite. As you can see, I was naturally talented. This is a photo that I believe was taken, it was taken in 2002, but I believe it was taken with a 2 or 3 megapixel camera that I rented from the school that I was attending at the time. And I think the background was an actual like printed out photograph from like, you know, Walgreens or something like that. And I scanned the photo, put it into Photoshop, and I composited it myself, feeding my friend's dog. So as you can see, I wasn't always good at compositing. It took me a long time to get good. So I wanted to show this photo so that when you look at the composites that I do, then you'll realize that, you know, you shouldn't compare yourself to where I am at now. You see where I was, you know, 15 years ago or so. So yeah, we all start somewhere. But anyway, so I could see a lot of problems with this image that I'm not really going to go into, mainly my wardrobe. I don't know why I was wearing that, but anyway, we're going to go into the images that you guys submitted. So we have a couple images here that I'm going to go through. This first one was submitted by someone with the name Mike Fitzpatrick. So thank you for submitting this, Mike. So we have this composite here. And by the way, a lot of these I've briefly looked at once. So I kind of wanted to get a instant reaction on the video. So I really didn't plan out what I was going to say for each of these, because a lot of times it's just better to just look at it and go with your initial reaction, and with you sort of discover new things that the image may have or doesn't have. So right off the bat, what I'm noticing most about this image is that this light source isn't really emitting any light. And by the way, I know this is a stylized image, and you know, there's filters and all kinds of stuff going on. And I think she's a ghost because she's transparent. So there's a lot going on in this image, but at the same time, it seems to be set in a realistic world because we have the ocean, the boats on the ocean, and we have this lantern on top of this thing here. So this barrel. So it looks like they were trying to go for some sense of reality, and because of that, I have to make that comment. If this lantern were here, the lighting on a lot of these items will be different. So I would just work with something like an exposure adjustment layer and make things brighter, and then invert the exposure adjustment layer and sort of paint with white on that layer mask to sort of, you know, create some highlights in different areas of the image, something like that. And if you really want it to be lazy, which I don't recommend, and I'm going to do that now just because I don't have the time, is just use the blend if slider to hide that selection from the dark color so that it only affects the bright ones. So then now that that light is affecting its environment. So keep an eye out for that. Sort of around the same topic, this barrel seems a little too flat. So maybe somehow create something like a dodge and burn layer. So fill that with 50% gray. You can do so by holding shift and backspace and then selecting 50% gray, setting it to soft light, and then just give it some shape by using the dodge and burn tools. You know, maybe darken the outside of it more. just looks a little too flat for my eye. So just work a little bit on lighting and making things seem like they really belong in this world. Also, just again, right off the bat, I really like the idea. It looks like there's a story going on here. There seems to be a ghost, as I said, and then this person is now dead, and it looks like they died defending their gold and their jewelry. He's got a gun. And you know, I like where this is going, but I would just also work more on emphasizing what the important part of the image is. In this case, it seems to be this area, just because it's the brightest part of the image. So if you zoom out, you can see like this is the brightest part of the image. So is that really the most important part? I'm not sure. I kind of would want to see more of this guy, maybe trying to figure out what she's doing. So yeah, it all depends on the story that you're trying to tell. And now that I'm looking at it, there's some weird things going on here in the sky. So I'm not sure what these elements are, but you know, maybe just go in there and mask them out, or clone them out, I should say. But anyway, so that's my thoughts on this first composite. And actually Mike submitted more than one, so I'm gonna go a little quicker through the rest. On this composite here, obviously it's very stylized and it's sort of like a fantasy scene, and it's pretty cool. The only thing that I would say is some of these spheres, I'm not sure if this is where you were going, but it seems like these people are inside those spheres. So I would make it more obvious. I sort of started playing around with this one and then I decided not to, because I wanted to show you guys on screen. So one of the ideas that I had was, if she were really inside of this green sphere, just make it green, make it more green. So the way I did that just was by going and using a selective color adjustment layer, going into the yellows and reds, and just reducing the magenta. The opposite of magenta is green. So we introduce green into the image, and that, in my opinion, makes it a little more realistic. So I don't know what you think about that, Mike, but that's just a suggestion. Another thing, again, we are in a fantasy world, but there seems to be some sense of reality. So maybe I would include some shadows on some of these flowers, because you have shadows on this little girl jumping around on the Legos. So I would assume that shadows are part of your world. So I would add shadows to this underneath the flowers hitting the spheres. Also maybe make a selection around the spheres here, duplicate it, and sort of create a reflection. So I'm going to try to fake that really, really quickly here. And obviously this is going to be very loose, but I hope that you get the idea. So just distort it and warp it so that it matches the contours of the sphere, and maybe change the blending mode to something like soft light, reduce the opacity. So now that sphere is reflecting the sphere next to it. So it, you know, creates a little bit more of reality. And if you really wanted to get fancy, you can come in here and maybe fake some highlights. So you can create a new layer, fill it with white, and then create another layer and fill it and hit delete, and we have that nice highlight, and we can change the blending mode to overlay or something like that and just bring the opacity way down. So, you know, there's a lot of things you can do to make things seem more realistic, so they're not so flat in the page. You know, you want to make them jump out of the screen, not necessarily just be like this flat collage image, unless that's the effect you want to go for, of course. In this image that also Mike Fitzpatrick submitted, I would work a little more on the separation between the different elements of the image. Again, it looks too flat, so maybe I would add more contrast to the things closest to us, or the things that are more important, maybe the horses and the different elements back here. I'm not really sure what you want the main focus of the image to be, but overall it seems very, very flat to me. So I would just work on making it not so flat by adding contrast to the important details, and also adjusting the luminance of certain things so they stick out. And this one's a very, very stylized image like all the ones that we've seen. This one I really don't have too many comments on, just because it seems to be the most fantasy driven, meaning I don't know if this is the style that they were going for. So I really would hate to make comments on things that are part of the style. It looks like there was a lot of filters that were run on through here, or at the very least, a lot of textures. So generally speaking, it's a good composite, but I would, again, work on the separation. I really don't know it still feels flat for some reason. So maybe work a little bit on this main character here that's closest to us, just so they separate more from the background. And I know it's a different color, but for some reason it just seems a little flat to my eye. But yeah, I would work on that. The next one is this composite by someone named Hashim Putiyakath, and excuse me if I mispronounce that, but this is their composite. And the biggest, I see a couple issues here. Number one, perspective. So as we know from watching my tutorials, if you haven't, you can check them out, but the horizon line is there. How do I know that? Because in this image, the ground plane is the water and the sky is here, and that's what it meets. So that perspective really doesn't match the edge of the water here. This edge will probably be higher. So maybe what this person can do just to make it a little more realistic would be to trying to figure out how I can do this without really distorting the image. I guess I'm going to have to distort it, but just move it up more, and with black, I'm just going to quickly rough it out just so that you guys get a better understanding of what I'm talking about, just when you have perspective in mind. So that looks just a little bit more realistic because the perspective, although it's not perfect, it matches better than what we had before. So anyway, there he is. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but look at the difference before and after. That's just because of the way the ground plane is and how you would really take the photo. You got to take those things into consideration. So make sure you think about that. Also, always add a black and white adjustment layer to your composite so that you can see the image without color. And sometimes when you see the image without color, you start seeing problems that you didn't see before, and that is that the luminance levels of the image don't match, so then things appear like they're just pasted on the photo. So in this case, I think he has too much contrast for his background. So something that you can do for that is use something like levels, and again, I'm going to rough it out here. Just make a selection out of him, and I'll just delete the layer mask, create a new one, so it creates a layer mask out of that selection. And I will just adjust the luminance values so that he's not as dark and it matches the background a little bit better. Maybe set it to luminosity, and once I remove the black and white adjustment layer, we see the result. So that's before and after. And notice that with the after, he seems like he fits a little more in this scene. So always keep in mind perspective, contrast, and all of that. Also, I'm not really sure about the scale of this boat. It's supposed to be sunken, but it's, obviously not. It's not being affected by the water, so maybe I would distort it, do something to make it look damaged. And also, I think that the scale is way off. Just there's something that doesn't seem right about the floor of the ocean here. I think the shark is okay. Maybe work a little more on the placement, and for some reason I think this bottom part is just too sharp. Maybe I would blur it a little bit. So let's try that. So maybe go into filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and blur it a little bit. Maybe not too much, just a tiny bit. And then also maybe make that part darker, because you wouldn't have that good visibility if you were really shooting underwater like that. But anyway, so those are some of the changes that I would make to this image. Also maybe work on the clouds a little bit, but I think you got enough to work on with the things that I suggested. So once again, to recap on this image, just make sure that things are in perspective. Once again, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say perspective, then you have to make sure that you find the horizon line and make sure that everything fits within that horizon line. And I have like 2 or 3 videos on YouTube where I talk about that, so you can check that out. Also, one thing that I'm looking at now is the environment itself it has a lot of different color tones. So if you want to make it easy on you and just make a cohesive color for the entire image, just use a color lookup adjustment layer and select something that gives a similar color tone to the entire image so that it matches better. So that's something else that you could do. So maybe dropping the blues is just an easy one there. It just makes everything seem more cohesive, or you can try to get fancy and do something with teal orange or whatever you have. But just make sure that the entire image has a cohesive color tone so that it looks more realistic. And I think that's it. Yep, that's it. This is mine again, and I could go on for days as to what's wrong with this image. I see, and by the way, look, some of the things that I mentioned on the other composites, I had the same problem. See, like if I create a black and white adjustment layer, like obviously this part stands out too much. So then I would give the same advice, you know, create a levels adjustment layer and reduce the contrast of that part so that it matches the scene better. Obviously the perspective is off. I wasn't paying attention to horizon lines or any of that. Also, the background is much blurrier and has less quality than the foreground, so I would have to match that. So there's so many things that I did wrong, and now they're so obvious, but when I first started, you know, I just didn't see it. So it comes with practice. Anyway, so let me look at the comments, and it looks like you guys have been having some fun in the comments, so that's that's pretty cool. Let me see. One of the questions was, is LAB color mode in Photoshop CS6? Yes, it is. When you combine photos into one, how do you make everything look not out of place, as if it's not a bunch of photos stuck together to each other? So I sort of answered that as I was going through the composites. Look at perspective, number one. Also look at contrast between things. As I mentioned earlier, one of the ways of really making sure that things are not out of place is by just creating a black and white adjustment layer and just looking at everything without color, just because things will pop out. Like in this case, as soon as I added that black and white adjustment layer, the boy sitting in the barrel really pops out. So that's one way of knowing that things are not out of place in terms of contrast. And then, you know, the other thing will be perspective, as I just said. So I have videos on YouTube with perspective, atmospheric perspective, that you should look at. I also have a video on matching saturation. So those videos are there on my YouTube channel, and you can check those out for more specific answers to that question. And I'm trying to see if there's any other comments. Tracy mentioned something about add rule of thirds too. I'm assuming she's referring, I'm not sure which composite you're referring, Tracy, referring to, but basically what that means is if, I guess I could do it with the crop tool, so make it quicker. So in the crop tool, we have these lines here. So essentially what rule of third means is that you would put your main subject in one of these thirds here so that the composition looks better. But anyway, if you guys don't have any other comments or questions, then I'm gonna have to let you go. It's already been about 30 minutes and I have to get going. I'm going to be visiting the Facebook campus in about an hour and a half in Menlo Park. So I have a friend there and I'm going to meet him for lunch. So I got to get going. It's almost lunchtime here. Any tips to add shadows? Yeah, so check out I have a video on YouTube called, I think it's like 1 hour tips and tricks or something like that. It's about a year old, and I show how to make shadows. All right, Christian says, thanks, this was great. Thanks so much, Christian. And once again, thank you everybody for watching and spending half an hour with me on this Friday morning for me. It may be Friday evening for you. So have a good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending where in the world you are. Thanks so much, and I will be talking to you guys soon. Bye-bye.